Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So again, coming to the discussion on technical barriers to trade. Now drawing the comparison between sanitary and phytosanitary measures, so far as the international standards are concerned. So there the international bodies do exist that support certain level of international standards, and those international bodies, they can give certain recommendations as well as set those guiding standards for the member states to follow. But so far as the technical barriers to trades are concerned, there are no such bodies to give those guiding standards. Now the question arises, so far as we have understood or the discussion has stated, that technical barriers to trade covers wide range of goods. That means goods both from the industrial perspective and the goods that are part of the agriculture trading system or agriculture trade. So whether there can be an overlapping effect of different WTO agreements when the technical barriers to trade are applied, or how that can be sorted out. So let's give a look to it. Can a measure fall both the technical barriers to trade and another WTO agreements? Besides now just exclude sanitary and phytosanitary measure agreement. The short answer is that yes, that it depends. As indicated above, if a measure concern services or government procurement, while it may fall under GATS, that is General Agreement on Trade in Services, or the Agreement on Government Procurement, these are two different set of agreements. The Agreement on Government Procurement is exclusively for the purpose of government procurement, and whereas GATS, that is exclusively for General Agreement on Trade in Services. It will not be a technical barriers to trade. That means since they are excluded, explicitly excluded, so there cannot be the trade of goods or let's say the trade of any such variables that are covered under these two agreements, that will not fall under technical barriers to trade. Neither, in addition to these two, neither the goods that are covered or any products that are covered under sanitary and phytosanitary measure agreement, that will not be covered under technical barriers to trade. This may, however, not necessarily be the case with other WTO agreements dealing with subject matter not expressly carved out by technical barriers to trade agreement. But so far as these three agreements are concerned, that is one thing. Now what about the rest of the WTO agreements? Now for the rest of the WTO agreements, that's not the case. So there can be overlapping effect with technical barriers to trade until and unless they are explicitly carved out. The relationship between technical barriers to trade agreement and GATT stems from the fact that, as stated in its preamble, the technical barriers to trade agreement is intended to further the objectives of the GATT. So basically, when we say that there can be overlapping effect, so the question arises whether there can be contradiction between these two different set of agreements, or there can be tension between the objectives of technical barriers to trade and on the other side the objectives of any other agreement that is in question. So there it's very clear that firstly the interpretation goes like this, that both these agreements or any agreements that come in interface with this technical barriers to trade, they both have one common goal, and that is to facilitate the trade, and also they are all in furtherance, all these agreements are in furtherance of the objectives of the GATT. This means that sometimes the consistency of the regulation can be examined under both technical barriers to trade agreement and the GATT. So how this can be interpreted, that the level of consistency or whatever the test has to be made. Like, let's say on the one hand there is a test for dumping practices under the dumping regulation, and then there is on the other hand there is test of covered under technical barriers to trade. So both the methodologies that are applicable in case of the dumping agreement, they are of different nature, and the methodologies that are applicable with regard to technical barriers to trade are of different nature, and that can be done. It's not that if the product is tested under the anti-dumping agreement, won't be tested under technical barriers to trade. So it can be done, or it can be examined, but this does not mean that these two agreements discipline product regulations in exactly the same way, because the both set of agreements have a different objective. Dumping is meant to know whether the right price has been attributed to the product which is meant for export. That means to know the difference between its actual value and the value that is quoted for the purpose of export, that is right or not, and then further to know whether it fulfills the criteria of this safety standards, and then under the technical barriers to trade regulation, or whether right kind of packaging has been done or not. So there it's very clear that we will be able to know by application of these two agreements whether the right kind of product at the right kind of price has reached the market of import, and then also it's not a threat to, or it's not a risk to the health of the human beings, plant or animal life. So in that way we can decide by applying both these set of agreements. As stated by the very first decision rendered in a technical barriers to trade dispute, the technical barriers to trade agreement imposes obligations on the members that seem to be different from and additional to the obligations imposed on the members under GATT 1994. So as stated that these agreements, they have different aims and objectives when we draw the comparison with technical barriers to trade and the application of the technical barriers to trade, and both are beneficial, and all these set of agreements are basically meant to facilitate the trade, but then that facilitation of trade should not be at the cost of human life, plant life, or the health of human and plant. So in both sense they are beneficial, and they both are playing what I need to add here, the regulatory measures. There are also other instances when only certain technical barriers to trade specific disciplines will apply. Now it can be that what role in some specific goods the main or the primary role is played by technical barriers to trade, and the other agreements plays the secondary role. There are also other instances when only certain technical barriers to trade specific disciplines will apply. Indeed, while both the technical barriers to trade agreement and the GATT contain similar non-discrimination obligations, and only technical barriers to trade agreement contains other obligations such as requiring members to ensure that their technical regulations will be not more trade restrictive than necessary. Now what is the further requirement? First is that both the or any set of agreements, whether it's the agreement in relation to technical barriers to trade, or the agreement relating to subsidy, or any such agreement related to the movement of goods, they should not be applied on a discriminatory basis. That is a very common, let's say, common principle that is working. Secondly, the technical barriers to trade can be considered as something in addition to what is stated in that particular or any different agreement. So if there is a subsidies agreement, or there is a agreement in relation to agriculture products, so the technical barriers to trade in that reference can be additional measures that are required to be fulfilled by an exporting nation, or requiring that regulation be based on relevant international standards. So where the discretion is possible, or the member state is given the chance to apply discretion, that is when it's the question of safety concern, when it's the question of health concern. But then those health concern, those safety concern, any such regulation based on these, that should not be beyond reasonableness. So all these concerns should be within the reasonable ambit, and sometime to know the extent of reasonableness, reliance has to be put on some international standards also, because if we go by the standards based on country specific measures, or the discretion being given to the nation and the nations being applying the standards based discretion arbitrarily, then that may be difficult for the WTO to sustain with the key principle of free trade. So in the light of these eventualities, it is expected that in situations where there is no standard mark existing, or there is a discretion being given to the member state to apply their own discretion, that has to be supported by some evidences also. Some covered agreements refer expressly to technical barriers to trade agreement, even if the technical barriers to trade agreement does not refer to them. Such references may provide some guidance on the relationship between those agreements with technical barriers to trade agreement. An example is the plurilateral agreement on trade in civil aviation, which states that the provisions of the technical barriers to trade agreement apply to trade in civil aircraft, and more specifically that civil aircraft certification requirements and specification on operating and maintenance procedure shall be governed as between signatories by the technical barriers to trade agreement. So it's clear that the provisions of technical barriers to trade, they sometimes becomes the guiding principle for making an agreement or for completion of a contract. That means since they are more in relation to quality, and that also the strict standards of quality, which may the compromise on which can be hazardous to the health of the people or to the other living beings. Therefore, it can be that the primacy is given to meeting the criteria as set by technical barriers to trade. So let's say if certain products are imported, and firstly it is stated that this should be the quoted price, and there should be no dumping practices or no subsidies being provided, but prior to the goods entering the market, like the goods have arrived to the port of destination, and prior to checking whether these were the dumped goods or what was the actual price of these goods, it is very important to know whether the right standards or the right qualities have been sent or not. That means the application of technical barriers to trade comes earlier or on a priori basis for the fulfillment of that contract, and later on whether the right kind of price has been attributed to that product or not, knowing that becomes the secondary thing. So that means in many times the agreements that become, or the contractual documents between the parties that become conditional to technical barriers to trade, that means if the producer or the exporter of that product is able to fulfill those quality marks or the quality standards, then only the product can be forwarded to be sold in the domestic market. So that kind of requirement gives quite strong weightage to these technical barriers to trade. An example is the plurilateral agreement on trade in civil. Here the example quoted is that of the civil aviation, which states that the provisions of the technical barriers to trade agreement apply to trade in civil aircraft. That means once the aircraft are exported to different countries, the civil aircraft, prior to that their export to their, or prior to the delivery, let's say like that, that in fulfillment of the contract they have to deliver these aircraft. So prior to that they must fulfill the quality marks and the safety marks, and if they do not fulfill those safety or the quality marks, then the entire contract become invalid. So that means this technical barriers to trade becomes plays the primary role. And more specifically that civil aircraft certification requirement and specification on operating and maintenance procedure shall be governed as between its signatories by technical barriers to trade agreement. Article 3.1 signatories note that provisions of the agreement on technical barriers to trade apply to trade in civil aircraft. In addition, signatories agree that civil aircraft certification requirements and specifications on operating and maintenance procedures shall be governed as between signatories by the provisions on agreement on technical barriers to trade. So the further maintenance procedure and also the quality check that is periodically done, not simply that it is one time facility being provided by the seller of the goods, but in certain cases it can be the warranty period, it can be the guarantee period, it can be the maintenance period, where the producer or the exporting country is supposed to provide the facilities for maintenance, repairment, and that also subject to the quality mark. So that means it has a long long duration effectiveness. The technical barriers to trade rules has a long duration effectiveness even after the goods are delivered to the parties concerned, and the other agreement is no more in pursuance, or the objectives of the other agreement has been fulfilled. So like if the goods are already exported based on any particular agreement, and the compliance of the provisions of that particular agreement has been checked and it has been found to be satisfactory. Now comes the compliance of technical barriers to trade. One was those technical barriers at the time when the goods have reached to the port of destination, or let's say to the importing market, and then after that also maybe the contractual document includes the quality conditions while repairment and while maintenance also, because maybe they have promised the quality will remain intact for another 20 years or another 10 years. So how that can be ensured, or in case there is something there is some degradation in that quality, or the quality has lowered down, then how that can be judged. So that means the technical barrier to trade agreement, or the standards that are set, it may have a long effect on the entire contractual document of the parties, or let's say the entire terms of the agreement between the parties. There are also instances when neither the technical barriers to trade agreement nor other WTO agreement refer expressly to each other. This is the case, for example, with the TRIPS agreement, which govern trade related aspects of intellectual property rights. Now there can be certain, again, some gray areas where both the different agreements are playing their nature and scope, but it's not clearly mentioned. So how that can be decided, that whether this falls within the domain of intellectual property right, or it falls within the domain of technical barriers to trade. Now this comes when we talk about the packaging issue, and also mentioning the safety measures that should be adopted while packaging, or the risk factors that are involved in handling the goods. Now that may have an overlapping effect with the trademark rules, or the kind of certification that has been given to that labeling, or to that, let's say, product. So whether that should fall under this trademark agreement, solely under the trademark agreement, or the technical barriers to, it should first pass through the technical barriers to trade agreement, and then the provisions of trademark should be applied. So that is like a kind of situation that may occur when we talk about the gray area between two different set of agreements. Many technical barriers to trade measure concern, among other things, regulation about the way products are labeled or packed. Now labeling and packaging can also be covered under trademark rules, but here those rules are meant for the public benefit, whereas the trademark rules are meant for the private interest of the parties. For example, a measure regulating for public health purposes the appearance of and any information contained in the labels and packages of certain consumer goods. Let's also assume that some of these labels and packages contain the brands of the manufacturers of those goods which are affected by this measure. Now if a certain producer it has planned to, or it has packaging of a different style, then putting the brand name in a different manner, they have also registered the kind of brand name they are using, and also the style, the way they are putting their brand name in, they have got it registered through the trademark laws and other IPR regulations, and let's say that gets affected by the technical barriers to trade. So how they can like use those the trademark rules. So where they have to give the primacy. So in that situation, again, the trademark rules, they need to be subject to the technical barriers to trade conditions, because here the objectives are very clear. They are meant for the public benefit, or for keeping in mind the risk factor of the public, whereas the trademark rules or the copyright rules, they are exclusively for the person or for an individual and his benefits. So let's also assume that some of these labels and packages contain the brand of manufacturer of these goods which are affected by this measure. Since brands are normally registered and protected as trademarks, can this labeling packaging measure be both technical regulations under Technical Barriers to Trade Agreement and an IP measure under the TRIPS agreement? Now that is the question. When confronted with similar question, the WTO dispute settlement panel stated that in principle this was possible in case of Australia tobacco plain packaging. This is the case where the issue between overlapping effect of technical barriers to trade, mainly concerning the packaging thing, and then the trademark issue that came before the court. Now comes the practical measures that are applied when judging whether a product fulfills the criteria as set under technical barriers to trade or not. So it's not simply whether the provisions are complied with, but 3-level test is done, and within that 3-level test, some of them are mandatory to be fulfilled, some of the criterias are mandatorily to be fulfilled, and some of the criterias are not that mandatory, or they are not that strict. So mainly how these measures are classified, they are: one is technical regulations, second is standard, and third one is basically to test whether these two are fulfilled or not, that is conformity assessment procedure. Now just we give a look to this 3 different measures. Technical regulation, what do we mean by technical regulations? Technical regulation lay down product characteristics or their related processes, like what basically this product is, product characteristics, what this product is about, like children's toys or refrigerator. So that shows the characteristics and how that is, like it's an electronic device, it is an electrical appliances, that is one. So if it is an electronic device, then what kind of how that is manufactured. If it is an electrical appliance, how that is manufactured, and what precautionary measures has to be applied while handling, if it is an electrical device, if it is a electronic device, if it's a mechanical appliance. So this is what we mean by technical regulation: lay down product characteristics or their related process and production methods. Compliance is mandatory. In this category, it's important to make things transparent. What is the kind of device, what are the how this is manufactured, its style of usage, how we are going to use it, what kind of precautionary measures have to be taken while its usage. So they are like mandatory requirement or mandatory parameters that has to be adopted. They may also deal with terminology, symbols, packaging, marking, and labeling requirements. So like it is given, all these are given in the instruction book or usual manual. It's a usage, it's a storage, all these things. Then comes the second part, that is the standards. Standards are approved by a recognized body that is responsible for establishing rules, guidelines, or characteristics for products or related process and production methods. So what is the basically production method used? Compliance is not mandatory in this case. They may also deal with terminology, symbols, packaging, marking, and labeling requirements. So in case of standards, that may require certain the requirements are there, but those requirements are not of mandatory nature. Now these standards can be something of that nature, like there is a model difference, there is a, let's say, size difference. So that also is we consider in different standards. All right, but for different standards we need not to explain what will be its effect every time. So the basic, that what is needed and is covered under the technical regulation, the same can be followed under the standard differences also, or the model is different, or let's say there is a minor change in technology, so that can be covered under the standards, product standards. Then is conformity assessment procedures. Conformity assessment procedures are used to determine that relevant requirements in technical regulations or standards are fulfilled. So that means firstly it's a not theoretical thing, but it is the practical thing. That means it is tested, that all the technical regulations, all the technical declarations that has been made by the producer, whether they are true to that information or not, or there is some difference. And secondly, all these technical technical information that is being given, they meet the quality standard or not, or they meet the standard regulations or not. So that is another important thing, and that should be tested through lab or through an expertise. Then they include procedures for sampling, testing and inspection, evaluation, verification and assurance of conformity and registration, accreditation and approval. So these are the kind of steps. Through this it will be clear whether the technical regulations or the standards that are declared by those manufacturers, they are fulfilled or not. And they are like the procedure for sampling. We go by sampling is an aspect of methodology. What kind of sampling has been done to know the effect. Then further it's testing, that is testing can be through lab or also through the empirical data collected by the users, the previous users, whether they accept that whatever has been declared in the technical side or in the standard basis, that has been complied with or not, or whatever has been ensured as the guarantee period, that there will be no let's say no quality degradation for the 2 years. So that cannot be judged simply on the lab, but it has to be that fact has to be known from the consumers who already have consumed the product and are using that for the last 2 years, for the last 3 years, how many times they had asked for repairing that product. So all that takes the different that all that data can be derived based on different style of methodology. Sampling, testing, inspection, evaluation, verification and assurance of conformity and registration, accreditation and approval. So all that is covered under conformity assessment procedures. What is technical regulation? Technical regulation set out product requirements with which the compliance is mandatory, that what this product should consist of. Like if it says that this product consists 100% steel, so that is the declaration made. So it can't be that it contains 90% iron and 10% aluminium, or if it contains, let's say, sodium, then it can't be that this product contains 90% sodium and 10% any other compound that is closer to that of sodium. So or if it contains pure gold, so it can't be that this if the declaration is made that this product contains pure gold, it can't be that 90% it has a pure gold and 10% silver or copper. So that is like the technical requirements, to what extent we can compromise and to what extent we cannot compromise. Technical regulations set out product requirement with which compliance is mandatory. They are normally instruments adopted by central government bodies such as parliament, regulatory agencies, ministers, etc. So they declare those regulations, that what should be the minimum technical requirement for that product, or what is the product requirement, the quality requirement, that is declared by the law making bodies, and that is like of absolute, that cannot be changed. I mean that can be changed by those law making bodies, but that cannot be deviated. So the producer or the exporter or the product has to abide by those laws. Types and product coverage may vary among technical regulations. Then there are types of the product within the same product, further classification. So there can be difference, like a big, small, different model, different utilities. So there can be differences. They may be specific, for example, establishing maximum permitted level of lead in paint used on toys, or prohibiting the use of certain additives in tobacco products. These are the example. That what is the declaration made, and in true sense what is the kind of product we are getting, or to what extent the risk has been disclosed, and what is the actual level of risk. Other regulations may be more general in nature, for example, establishing criteria for labeling of organic agriculture product, or providing for emission requirements for diesel engines. What all of these measures have in common, however, is that they all involve some form of government intervention. That means these regulations are mainly guided by the government or central authorities. After getting the data, like if the use of lead is banned, then from where the government gets the data, that is by the analysis done in the research laboratories, or to what extent this can be used, that again will be based on the data it has obtained from experts' opinion. They all involve some form of government intervention, law, regulation, decree act, etc., regulating what characteristics product must have or not have, or how they must be produced. And next is, such requirements may affect trade and market access opportunities for the product concerned, because that directly the knowledge about these things, the declaration or disclosing these details, will affect the sale, and not simply it's affecting the sale, but it is also affecting the health concern of the people or the users. Next, within that measures, the next one was standards. So we define here standards. What we mean by it: standards can be developed by a large number of different entities located in members' territories, including both governmental and non-governmental bodies. Like technical regulations, standard also establish product specification, characteristics they should or should not have, details on how they should be produced. However, unlike technical regulations, standards are not mandatory and therefore compliance is voluntary. So it can't be that the product will be prohibited if these standards are not met, but it is expected that the producer do follow these standards. Like it was with regard to the size, if in particular size the changes has to be made, then if the changes are not made, so or the minor changes are made, let's say the technical requirements are mandatory requirements for any product, and those mandatory technical requirements have been met, but then there are minor deviations, and those deviations depend upon the size of the product. So if those deviations, let's say they are expected that those deviations should be improved, or it should not increase from this proportion, but it as a matter of fact it has increased from that proportion. That means with the change in size, the standards have not been met. So whether that will lead to prohibition on that product? No. So that is the kind of thing. But if the technical requirements, if that are not met, so then there can be prohibition in the sale of that product. In practice, standards are often used as the basis for both technical regulations and CAPS, that is again conformity assessment procedure. In such cases, a product requirement set out in the standard become mandatory by virtue of government intervention in the form of technical regulations or CAP. Now, but those deviations, as we were discussing in terms of standard, that cannot be very wide. So again, how that is capped or how that is restricted, that are restricted against again by the technical regulation clause or through the CAPS, conformity assessment procedures, whether to what extent the producer has maintained those technical standards or the technical requirements. If there is a major deviation in that, then the product can be prohibited. Now then, concerning standards, there can be private standards also, that can be suggestion countries depending upon the cultures. But the question is, if those standards are not met, then whether what can be the remedies. So there are no such remedies when the standards are private in nature. So here it states there has been some discussion over the years on the topic of private standards in technical barriers to trade committee. These documents are normally developed by private entities, example companies, non-governmental organizations, for example, to manage supply chains or respond to consumer concerns, because consumers maybe they are liking this product better or this model of the product better, so or some design, added design to that product they want. So that is like the private choice, that is not related to the quality of the thing. So there whether that is mandatory requirement to be met, no, that's not the mandatory requirement to be met. non-governmental organization, etc., for example, to manage supply chains or respond to consumer concerns. They may include environmental, social, food safety, ethical specifications. Despite their voluntary nature, some argue that they de facto affect market access and trade. Now, if too much of private choices are allowed, so that will affect the market, and that will affect the producers, let's say, options also. So the producers also has limited options many a times, and too much of reliance on the need of the market or the demand from the market side may reduce the options, and even the producer may have to face losses. They may include, but then there can be positive sides of those standards that are related to environmental concern, social concern, food safety, or ethical specification. Despite their voluntary nature, some argue that they de facto affect market access and trade. There is a debate as to whether private standards are covered by technical barriers to trade agreement. Some members take the view that they are not covered. So it depends how the member states they accept it, and some members accept that they do not cover the private concern. That means the technical barriers to trade are mainly the concern that is suggested by the government of the state, reflecting what is the requirement of the people. There is a debate as to whether private standards are covered by the technical barriers to trade agreement. Some members take the view that they are not covered. Those who believe they are covered have raised concern about the trade restrictive effect of private standards at the WTO. So if the private standards are accepted on an equal basis as that of the state based standards, then if not compliance of those standards, that may lead to restrictions on the sale of goods, or that may again lead to the protectionism or the new kind of barriers that will be involved if those private standards are not met. Those who believe they are covered raised concern about the trade restrictive effect of private standards at the WTO. Specific concerns include a higher level of stringency of requirements set out in private standards, because there is always a, let's say, suspicion or there can be that those private standards, they put higher level of standards than that of the general standards, even if the non-compliance of those may not be that hazardous or that may not be that injurious, but since that becomes part of the practice, or that becomes part of the recommendation in the light of those standards, so that may be again quite a big burden for the producers. Specific concern include higher level of stringency of requirements set out in private standards compared with those in regulations, rapid proliferation of private standards, and lack of transparency. In sanitary and phytosanitary committee, members have agreed on certain actions to share information on private standards. Standards are specifically addressed by the Code of Good Practice for the preparation, adoption, and application of standards code contained in Annexure 3 of Technical Barriers to Trade. The code, which is open to acceptance by any standardizing body within the territory of the member, contain detailed obligation and guidance on the process of setting standards. So prior to the standardization, there has to be like why those standards are required, that should be clear, what kind of obligations are set because of those standards, and guidance on the process of setting standard, that should be elaborated. Then only it will be known to the producer what is the requirement of that particular state. For instance, the code contains various obligations concerning transparency in standard setting activities. So that is like they set the code which is, I repeat this, the code which is open to acceptance by any standardizing body within the territory of the member, contains detailed obligations and guidance on the process of standard setting. So it must be like a guidebook that why these standards are required and how these standards can be set. For instance, the code contains various obligations concerning transparency in standard setting activities. Example, periodic notification of a standardization work program, accepting comments by interested parties on draft standards, etc. Then is conformity assessment procedures. Conformity assessment procedures are used to determine whether products fulfill the requirements established by relevant technical regulations or standards. So whatever has been declared in terms of technical regulation, that should be abided, that should be mandatorily abided, or whatever are the standards declared, whether that has been fulfilled or not. Although fulfillment of standards may not be mandatory, but to know whether that has been fulfilled or not, or if those standards are declared, whether those has been complied with or not. So how that can be known, or how that can be decided? So that is through the process covered under conformity assessment procedures, precisely because they give consumers confidence in the integrity, safety and trustworthiness of the product. Now this is the, after the test of conformity assessment procedure has been applied, after the test of conformity assessment procedure has been applied and approval has been given, or the certification has been given on the basis of these tests, then the consumer will have the confidence that they can use this product as an eatable, or this is suitable for their health, there will be no harm. So then like precisely because they give consumers confidence in the integrity, safety and trustworthiness of the product, conformity assessment procedures add value to manufacturers, marketing claims and ultimately to product themselves. So that gives them like open access or free access to the market. The people are confident, they are not worried if they are consuming the foreign product, or they may not then have a discriminatory approach in their mind. Usually what is the case, that the consumers, they may be cynical with the foreign product, whether that is good for their health or not, or what are the production process applied, whether that is not harmful, such like processes are not harmful. So that once that is declared by these conformity assessment procedures, they feel confident and they can freely use that product. Typical caps include testing. Now how that works, the cap thing works, what are the various methods? It is not something subjective that the files have been sent for the approval and files have been signed, but it requires certain procedural aspect or fulfillment of certain criteria, and that criteria is based on the practical examination through lab testing or through the other methods of testing. So typical caps include testing, sampling, inspection and certification as well as accreditation. So it will be tested in lab, samples will be collected, or the methodologies of sampling will be applied, then they will be inspected, and later on the certificate of its fulfilling these criteria will be granted. Certification as well as accreditation of laboratories carrying out tests, for example, giving that different type of caps affect trade differently, depending, for example, on how strict these procedures are. A key issue under technical barriers to trade discipline is a choice of which procedure is used in particular situation. So it may be that in some categories the strict rules are mandatory, but in another category the strict rules are not mandatory, because technical barriers to trade cover all kind of goods, whether they are the agriculture goods or the industrial goods. So maybe the in certain cases the goods that are industrial goods, the health concern or other requirements, they may not be as stricter as that of the agriculture goods that are consumed in terms of eatables or consumed by the consumers, and there are chances of health concern. So in such cases the application of technical barriers to trade can be stricter. So there again that may vary depending upon the type of product, depending upon the kind of risk that product carries, or also the kind of standards that are required. Now these are how these can be set, that is again based on the lab report, that is again based on the previous data the countries do have, and the scientific evidences that we need this much of minimum standard requirement. Here the technical barriers to trade agreement seeks to avoid those choices that result in cap unnecessarily hindering trade. Now that is like limitation, that to what extent these technical barriers to trade or conformity tests can be applied. So it should not be unnecessarily hindrance to trade. So that is why I just stated that the stricter rules can be applied for agriculture products, stricter rules can be applied, stricter testing methods can be applied for the products that are to be consumed in terms of eatables, but or they are more higher risk to health. But for those that are not higher risk to health, or they are not eatables, in that case is still applying harder cap rules or harder testing rules that might unnecessarily create hindrance to the free trade, or that can be some type of discriminatory approach, or can be some type of restrictive approach being applied to those products. One factor that might influence this choice is the level of risk posed, that is whether the product is in high risk category, or does have no risk or has a mild risk, by the product not confirming the relevant specification. For example, third party certification may be the choice of some members in situation in which the risk of harm is sufficiently high. Now in certain cases it can be that they may go for third party certification, where they find the product can be very hazardous, or the stakeholders are the children. So there are chances that the children may easily get affected by this product. So why not to take the third party opinion also? This type of procedure tends to be stricter and thus more costly than the supplier's declaration of conformity. So in those cases, like whatever supplier has decided and the lab test has also been done, but maybe the supplier is not ready to accept the lab test. So why not to take the third party opinion? For example, let's say the products are introduced, the children products are introduced in country A, and prior to its introduction in country A, certification has been given by the exporting country's lab that it fulfill the safety measure or the health concern of the children. Now the country A, which is an importing country of that child product, is not ready to accept that certification or doubts that certification. So what is the way out? That it goes for its own testing. So the country A goes for its own testing for finding out whether the product that is entering the market is free from the hazards or is risk free, mainly for the use of the children. Now whatever is the report given by that the labs or the testing methods in country A, let's say, is not acceptable by the producer or by the exporting country. So what is the option left? They go for the third party option, that let these tests be done in some another country, or let us seek the report from some another place where this product has been in usage. And that again, like, it can be two things are involved there. That can be more time taking, it can be more expensive, which is commonly used in situations where risks are high. Under the technical barriers to trade agreement, members are free to make such choices provided they do not restrict trade beyond what is necessary. So that choice is always there, but when is that choice an option or is a viable option? When the risk factor is high, when the stakeholder is very vulnerable. But applying those extra options in general cases, that may lead to protectionist policies, that may lead to unnecessary restriction being imposed or increasing the cost of those products. The application of technical barriers to trade rules should be non-discriminatory, as stated earlier also, like the use or application in sanitary and phytosanitary measure is non-discriminatory. Non-discrimination, avoidance of unnecessary barriers to trade, and the use of international standard as well as TA and S&D treatment for developing and less developed countries. Transparency, an additional core element in technical barriers to trade, is dealt separately. So there are definitely options available for developing countries and less developed countries, considering the level of development and considering the scientific knowledge or scientific base they do have. Also realizing the fact that for them the trade of goods across the border is necessary to obtain the foreign exchange. It is made a bit flexible. The rules in concerning the technical barriers to trade are made flexible, and then, as we have already discussed, in sanitary and phytosanitary measure there are special and differential treatments also. For developing and least developed country, transparency, an additional core element of technical barriers to trade, is dealt with separately. Now, the government regulate for many reasons, such as to protect. Now, why these firewall? Like, let's say that technical barriers to trade are kind of firewalls or kind of hedges being created as a protectionist measure, in the sense of protecting the health, not the protectionist in the sense of economic benefit provided to their domestic producers, or for creating the market policy in favor of their own producers. It's not protectionist in that sense, but in the sense of human health, safety, protection to the environment, or to provide consumers with information about various aspects of the product they are going to consume, so that they remain aware about what they are going to consume, and later on what can be its effect. For example, a government may require household appliances, say refrigerator, to display a label with information about their energy efficiency, or it may prohibit the sale of toys containing hazardous substances such as lead. So all these are like technical barriers to trade. So in the packaging, the refrigerator may be required that the extent of energy usage by that appliance, and then the example that is quoted here, that is the sale of toys to the children, because the children are more vulnerable to many kind of chemicals or ingredients that are used in those toys. Regulations normally affect all products, domestic or imported. That is also why regulations normally affect international trade. So here mainly it is the international trade in question. So these technical barriers to trade that may have a different format for the goods that are traded within the domestic system. That means if there is one country like United States or India, and the goods are produced in that country and they are sold in the domestic market only, they are not exported. So there we the technical barriers to trade kind of thing, or so the quality checks or the quality measures, they are of different standard or they are in different format. But for international trade, where we are talking about the goods that are available in the market from anywhere in the world, and mainly when that concerns the eatables or other even the other goods that may affect not simply the health directly the health, but it may affect the environment, and as a consequence of affecting the environment it may affect the health. So in that cases there has to be an international regulatory order to fulfill those criteria. Only after that the products can be entered into the market. But then, as stated earlier, there are chances of its misuse, or there are chances of its wrong application. So in the cases the products are of such nature that may not be risky at all, or they might be having minor risks. So in such cases, why to go by the stringent rules of technical barriers to trade. So regulations normally affect all products, domestic or imported. That is also why regulations normally affect international trade, and there is nothing extraordinary about this. So definitely the nations, they need to put check on these trade. Take the above mentioned labeling regulation, for example. Its policy objective could be described as protecting the environment by better informing consumers about energy efficiency of the appliances they buy. Given such objectives, would it make sense to, for example, require affixing labels only to domestically produced refrigerators while excluding importers one? So that is why it's not only discriminatory that we are asking the international exporters, in case of the refrigerator quoted as example is referred here, but the same marks or the same requirements are put for the domestic producers of refrigerator, and so that they are both in equal terms when the technical barriers to trade rules are applied. Now here, what do we mean by non-discrimination? Let's give a look to it. Technical regulations, members shall ensure, covered under article 2.1 of this technical barriers to trade rules, members shall ensure that in respect of technical regulations, products imported from the territory of any member shall be accorded treatment no less favorable than that accorded to like products of national origin and to like products originating from any other country. Next is the standards, because the discrimination can be again in three measures. Like we have discussed about three major tests in terms of technical barriers to trade agreement. So discrimination can be in either of these three measures. So we need to take a precautionary step that in either of these three measures, there should be no discrimination. So first is in case of technical requirements, technical regulation, no one is given favorable treatment. Second is standard requirement. In respect of standards, the standardizing body shall accord treatment to products originating in the territory of any other member of the WTO no less favorable than that accorded to like products of national origin and to the like products originating in any other country. And then is confirmatory test, that is the results that we get after the lab test or the expert's opinion. So the confirmatory assessment procedures, members shall ensure that in cases where a positive assurance of conformity with technical regulations or standard is required, like let's say that we want the minimum standards to be maintained or minimum technical regulations to be maintained. How that will be known? That will be known through testing. So there cannot be any deviation, whether it's the domestic product or the imported product. Members shall ensure that in cases where a positive assurance of conformity with technical regulations or standards is required, their central government bodies apply the following provisions to products originating in territories of other members. Conformity assessment procedures are prepared, adopted, and applied so as to grant access for suppliers of like product originating in the territories of other members under condition no less favorable than those accorded to supplier of like product of national origin or originating in other country in a comparable situation. Assess entails suppliers' right to an assessment of conformity under the rules of procedure, including when foreseen by this procedure, the possibility to have conformity assessment activities undertaken at the site of facilities and to receive mark of the system. Now with this we are over with the chapter on technical barriers to trade, and soon we will take the discussion on another topic, that is the dispute settlement body. For now, I thank you for being part to this discussion. So see you soon in the next topic. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to this piece of literary snippet. We usually know William Shakespeare as the most revered figure in the history of English literature. But we often tend to forget that he has also been one of the most hated figures in literature. And here I'm not talking only about those boys and girls who have to memorize long sections from Macbeth or King Lear or Julius Caesar before they can go and sit for their school or college exams. But I'm also talking about people who are themselves quite famous authors. Tolstoy, for instance, considered the writings of Shakespeare to be, and I quote, crude, immoral, vulgar, and senseless. George Bernard Shaw absolutely loathed Shakespeare, as he did Homer. But perhaps no other criticism about Shakespeare is more damaging than the one which says that Shakespeare is a marvelous storyteller, provided someone has told him the story earlier. Now, this piece of criticism is particularly damaging because it is true. None of Shakespeare's plays contain any original story whatsoever. They are all written using pre-existing materials, pre-existing stories. Now, does that diminish the stature of Shakespeare as a dramatist? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. See you in the next episode of Literary Snippets.